Hi and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at some US politics, in particular interest groups in the USA. So this is a key part of the US political system and is part of my playlist on A-level politics and in particular my section on USA politics. So this comes from the A-level specification by EDEXCEL. We're looking at component 3A and this is section 5.3, interest groups in the USA. And what it tells us we need to know is their significance, resources, tactics and debates about their impact on democracy, the influence, methods and power of at least one single interest group, professional group or policy group. So I'm going to look at all those aspects of that first bullet point in detail, and I'm going to examine as my single example, I'm going to look at the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which is arguably one of the most powerful interest groups in the US and one that's under some fairly close scrutiny at the moment after some recent scandals. So to start off with, one of the things we need to understand is the different types of interest group. So you've got professional groups. These tend to represent the interests, often the economic interests of particular professional groups. So for example, the American Medical Association, it represents the interests of doctors in the US who have joined that organization. You get policy groups that attempt to look at whole policy areas such as foreign policy. So you have, for example, the Centre for International Policy, and that tries to influence government policy over all issues of foreign policy. And then you have single interest groups who campaign on specific or limited issues. An example of that would be one I'm going to look at in more detail later on, which is the NRA, the National Rifle Association. The significance of these interest groups then is really kind of wide-ranging. So they're significant because they can access government at many different points. And one of the things with the US system, with it has so many layers and so many elected officials, that it really does allow interest groups a large area in which they can work. Now this is partly down to the separation of powers in federal government. So you might try and access government through the executive by campaigning or trying to persuade a president or a member of the cabinet or the key figures in an executive agency. Or you might go to members of Congress, you might go to members of the House, you might go to members of the Senate. If you think one party is more likely to support you than the other, then you might go to that. So there's all kind of different ways that it can act. Now, federalism is also really important in terms of areas of access, because an interest group might decide to focus more on state governments and legislatures rather than federal governments. So, for example, the pressure groups who are pushing for tighter and tighter laws on abortion in the US, they're likely to focus their initial action on the state governments in southern states where they're more likely to make progress. I mean, they might go in terms of the separation of powers. They might decide that the best way to go is to go through the Supreme Court or through the court system. So I mean, you can choose whichever institution as an interest group you think will be most receptive to your ideas, and that might depend on the party that's in control of it at that particular moment in time. It might be related to your issue and in terms of who has jurisdiction over it. So if you're doing something that falls under state jurisdiction, then you're better off going to a variety of state legislatures than you are going to federal government. And what all this means is failure to have impact on one institution doesn't mean complete failure. There are lots of other places to go and try. And also, because most of these areas are elected, then you might fail at one point. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to fail in future issues as you go further down the line. And one of the big bits with this is that politicians are open to persuasion. Now, this might be due to weak party discipline or lack of party leadership. And it might mean that the things like the individual voting records might be really key to someone's election. So if they're seen as voting a particular way on a particular issue, then that might play very badly or might play very well with their constituents. And that might be really important for getting them re-elected, more than having gone the party line on a particular issue. And again, if you're successful on this, and you might as an interest group get to a point where you have a group of politicians or a politician who will champion your cause, who will present legislation you've written or ideas that you have to a broader audience through their platform in Congress or as a member of the executive, either at federal or state level. Another bit that really plays into the hands of interest groups in this, and something I get very excited about, is, as I've mentioned already, elections take place, and they take place incredibly frequently. And there's lots and lots of positions which are elected in America. So the whole of the House and a third of the Senate is elected every 2 years. So each individual senator has a 6-year term, but a third of the House comes up every 2 years. And interest groups know that their money plays a massive role in elections. So this has been particularly the case since Citizens United versus FEC, and then it's massively increased the scope for interest group spending. So candidates may become more and more reliant on interest groups funding for their campaigns, and therefore they can't afford to upset them. So interest groups, and not all interest groups are going to have a chance, no matter how much money they've got, on particular politicians from particular parties, but it might well be that there's some alignment already in terms of your ideas and their ideas, that you can get someone who's more full-heartedly on board with your program. And this huge range of officials at federal and state level, all needing funding to run for election quite frequently, really does mean that there's a huge scope for influence from these pressure groups, these different interest groups. Another really fundamental point for the significance of interest groups in the US is that groups' rights are protected. So the US has an entrenched and sovereign constitution that protects rights across the board. Some groups campaign on rights that are enshrined in the Constitution itself, and that's one of the ones I'm going to look at in more detail later on is the NRA. Well, they campaign on the Second Amendment, so that is enshrined in the Constitution, and so they've got a kind of foot in the door before they even start. The First Amendment obviously is one of the most important ones when it comes to pressure groups, because it promotes the idea of the freedom of expression. And so through all of this, all groups in America have a right to present their ideas. And they might well find that the Supreme Court will rule in their favour because of the things in the Constitution, particularly elements such as the First Amendment, which protects their right to say whatever it is they want to say. And so this means that the rights of all interest groups are protected, even the most extreme ones, because of the nature of the US political system and the Constitution. Now, one of the other key elements in how the interest groups work is their resources, and their resources might take various different forms, and some might be particularly strong in one area but not in others, and the most successful interest groups are likely to tick the boxes in all of these different things. So the first one is financial. To be really successful as an interest group, the chances are you need to be very wealthy. You need to spend huge amounts of money on publicity campaigns, on supporting candidates, on lobbying. Now, lobbying is always one of those bits that I just find mind-blowing in terms of the amount of money that's spent on it. So in 2016, the total federal lobbying spend was $3.1 billion. And that's only the money that must be declared by federal law. There's loads of other spending outside that isn't within the jurisdiction of what must be declared. So there's an incredible amount of money being spent. And this does pose the question. I think this is very much like all the money that goes into advertising. If it didn't work, they wouldn't spend the money. So these interest groups, these lobbying groups that are spending over $3.1 billion, they must believe that this is going to have an impact and is going to change the minds of politicians and get things on the political agenda and get things through that they want. Otherwise, surely they wouldn't be spending that kind of money. Just like advertisers spend millions and millions of dollars on advertising campaigns, and we look at it and go, well, why are they doing that? Well, it must work. It must work on some of us, and it must get us to buy things. Another key component of the resources is their membership. So large and active membership will mean an interest group is likely to be highly influential. Because what they can bring about is grassroots pressure. They can get people out, they can mobilize them. And this means that they can show that they can have a significant impact on electoral outcomes due to support of a candidate or opposition to a candidate. And maybe even just the simple mobilization of a vote in a swing area could make a really big impact. And they might get that membership to do things as well, like writing in to their members of Congress. And if they receive enough emails or letters, then that can have a big impact as well. And again, mass protest would be another area where a large membership really plays an important role. Another important part of the resources that a pressure group or interest group might have is expertise. So groups often do have this. They have expertise in their particular area of interest. This might include academic or research expertise. It might be experts with experience of years of working in a particular field, an area that the interest group is interested in. It might be legal expertise, and particularly focusing on constitutional law. And one of the big expenses of a lot of interest groups is making sure they have really, really top legal teams that can fight their cases, and fighting their cases through the court system is a really, really important part of interest groups' activity in the US. There's many kind of examples that highlight that. One of the key ones is the NAACP, which has used the courts for a very long time. Probably the most notable case is the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Another resource that interest groups must have is they must have the right contacts. So they will employ professional lobbyists. Now, these are often former politicians or former political advisors. And this idea of building a network of contacts can give interest groups very high levels of influence. And this really does highlight that it's not just what you know, but who you know that really counts. And this is demonstrated by a couple of things I'm going to go through in a bit more detail, which are revolving doors and iron triangles. Now, these are really, really important. Revolving door syndrome is a really important idea in all of this. So this is when former members of Congress or former members of the executive take jobs, normally with really high salaries, for lobbying firms. They are hugely valuable to those firms because they have the contacts and the knowledge within Congress or within the different departments, where they can give some real insight and potentially bring about change. Now, given that they are lobbying institutions that they used to be members of, this really does give them an unfair advantage, which is why they can demand the really high salaries. Now, about 60% of those leaving Congress 2017 to 19 went on to work for these kind of lobbying firms. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a Democrat, and Ted Cruz, who's a Republican, have both spoken out against this process, saying that there either should be essentially a lifetime ban from joining one of these lobbying firms, or at least a time period in between. Now, Ocasio-Cortez and Ted Cruz are not normally kind of names you would put together. They're normally the opposite ends of the political spectrum in the US Congress. So we can see here that we're seeing on both sides some degree of concern about this as an issue, and particularly given the hugely high percentage of former members of Congress who are going this route, we can see why that would cause a degree of concern. Now, another part of this is what's known as the iron triangle syndrome. So this is where there is a relationship between pressure groups, congressional committees, and federal departments or agencies. So, for example, with the NRA, they fund campaigns for members of Congress, some of whom sit on the Armed Services Committee and the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, which have oversight of parts of the executive and some control over the funding and remit of them that impact on gun laws. So this includes the Department of Justice and the Bureau for Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. So in this, we've got the NRA sticking people in Congress who are then getting on committees, and those committees are overseeing the area which the NRA is particularly interested in. And it's not unique to the NRA. This happens with a whole range of different interest groups. So these iron triangles, when they're formed, are then incredibly strong, and this again suggests an undue or unfair level of influence. Some of the different tactics used by the different interest groups, and these do vary from group to group. Some will use all in different methods at different times. Some will concentrate on some methods and not others. So the first method is using the courts and legal methods. Again, as I mentioned already, the US political system really kind of lends itself to this with a sovereign constitution. The NAACP in particular has fought a lot of its campaigns through the courts, notably Brown versus Board of Education in '54. And there are different ways that interest groups might try and influence the legal process. One of it might be, like the Brown versus Board of Education, might be by initiating a case. So it might be through amicus briefing. So this is providing information during a court case. So, for example, the NRA did this during DC versus Heller. It might be trying to influence nominations to the Supreme Court. So, for example, Americans for Prosperity, which is a really major interest group in the US, was one of a particular kind of libertarian and conservative interest group, was one of many groups that spent substantial amounts of money, I mean, said to be in seven figures, on pushing for Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation as the Supreme Court Justice. At the same time, there was about 150 interest groups that signed letters and things opposing her confirmation, including the NAACP and the NARL, Pro-Choice America. So what we'll often see with this is interest groups acting against each other, but we have these three different methods in which they can use the court and legal system. Another method we see is one I've mentioned already, which is lobbying, which is trying to contact and persuade those in power to change their minds on something, or to vote a particular way, or to back a particular campaign. And this is often done using professional lobbyists. With many access points to the interest groups, many lobby members being former members of the federal executive, or members of Congress, or state governors, etc. There's lots of different places where they might go, and there's lots of people that might have held those jobs in the past who are now working for the lobby groups. A group might even draft a piece of legislation and try and find politicians willing to propose it and support it. The chance of success is increased because there is a lack of party discipline in the US system, which means that not all of a party might go with the party line, and you might just need a few members of Congress on the opposing side to come over to your view. An example of this is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee that targeted a small number of Democrats, including Chuck Schumer of New York, over Obama's deal with Iran. And it was not just with Obama and Iran, it was multiple countries with Iran, and it was about Iran's nuclear program. And they managed to change Chuck Schumer's mind. They didn't manage to do enough overall to stop the agreement coming into place. But again, it's showing this idea that you don't necessarily have to go after the whole Democrat Party or the whole Republican Party. What you might do is you might find, well, actually, the balance of power between the two is fairly close. I mean, it's really, really close in Congress at the moment. And therefore, you might need to work on a few waivers somewhere in the middle. And if you can move them over, then you can change the direction of a bill. Another area that's often used is grassroots activity and direct action. Members might take actions themselves, such as email campaigns or public protests. Groups will often encourage members and also wider members of the public to contact their member of Congress to help them find out, and might help them find out how to do that. They might then also give them a kind of a draft version of what they should say, or what they should email or write in to their member of Congress or their senator. The NAACP runs what known as Moral Mondays. This is the Moral Monday campaign. This spread out of North Carolina, and it encourages people to protest on a whole range of topics now. Now, publicity and including advertising campaigns is another kind of really important area of or important tactic of different pressure groups. So this can be traditional forms of advertising, such as in the print media or on billboards. Increasingly, it's been TV ads, and then in the most modern era, it's shifted digital ads, largely targeting people through social media. And the aim of this is to affect how people vote. Again, so for example, the NRA back in 2012 carried out a series of TV attack ads on Obama, who they saw as kind of heading the charge in terms of increasing gun control. Now, there is a debate about whether interest groups have an impact, what kind of impact these interest groups have on democracy. Is it a positive one or is it a negative one? Now, on the positive side, you can say, well, they do a really great job in terms of participation. They get people involved in politics, allowing them to voice their view on key issues, which they might not get to do just through simply voting. And they offer an opportunity for grassroots activism. They raise awareness of government policies, and they redress some of the damage done by the restricted choices created by the two-party system. So you might have issues that aren't burning issues that are pushed by either of the major two political parties, but are really important to people. And interest groups give them an opportunity to people to participate in the political process and to push those ideas. Also, you can say that the interest groups act as an important check on government. They do this by raising awareness of government activity or inactivity if they said they were going to do something and they aren't doing it, so they aren't meeting targets, for example. And therefore they act as a check on government power. They can also shine a light on corruption and self-interest within government. And groups such as the NAACP and the ACLU specialise in protecting rights and therefore make sure the government isn't stepping on the rights of US citizens. They also play an important role in terms of representation. So pressure groups, interest groups help represent the views of minority groups that might otherwise have not been heard. So this is an idea that they're promoting pluralism, meaning that the interests of all are being presented for consideration before a compromise ultimately is found. There is, of course, a counter-argument to all of this. First of all, we often, well not often, but we will at times see pressure groups, interest groups step over into violence or illegal activity. And when protest does this, it damages democracy and has a really negative impact. And this can clearly be seen with the Capitol protest, well, the Capitol invasion on the 6th of January 2021, the attack. And again, that was hugely damaging to democracy. We also can argue, or see an argument, that the interest groups restrict elected government. And this happens when an interest group or group of interest groups stop the actions of elected government from doing what they were elected to do. And this was seen, for example, by interest groups acting to block aspects of Obama's Affordable Care Act, a key policy on which he was elected twice. We also seen this with interest groups blocking the policies of Trump when he was in power from 2016 to 2020. Again, doing things that he said he was going to do if he got elected. And then we see the interest groups stepping in the way and stopping some of those. And there's also this argument about a great deal of inequality of representation. And what can happen is that interest groups, in effect, promotes elitism, as it's only really the interest groups that have the access and the contacts and the money that are likely to have a big impact on decision makers. And therefore, it's not a level playing field. This is another area where the elites, the rich, the powerful, the influential already will just wield more power and influence, which is kind of a counter to the earlier point about pluralism. So the final part of this part of the spec has to look at the influence, methods and power of at least one single interest group. And we're going to have a look at the NRA, the National Rifle Association. Now, this was originally formed back in 1871, and it was originally about gun safety, but then particularly from the late 60s into the 70s, it became focused on gun rights, as it felt gun rights were under threat. It is highly influential, and it has very strong links with the Republican Party and many elected representatives from the Republican Party. There are some, admittedly mainly Democrats, who would say that effectively the NRA owns the Republican Party, and the Republican Party won't do anything without the NRA's say so. And part of the reason it goes back to the other things that we've talked about earlier with resources. It has 5 million members and is very well funded, and in the past has been very well run. And therefore it has the resources at its disposal. It has the grassroots, it has the money, it has the lobbyists, it has the kind of insider links. That means it's likely to be able to present its ideas and get them across. It has particularly been powerful in rallying grassroots support against any politicians that support greater gun control and for supporting any that oppose it, and that can swing election campaigns and a re-election, all different things like that. There are, however, some very major scandals connected with the NRA, in particular surrounding the leadership of Wayne LaPierre, and others who were said to have been involved in some fairly major corruption and spending NRA money on their own private things. And this has reached the extent where it potentially threatens the future of the organisation. So the NRA is being sued by the Attorney General in New York, Letitia James, and there is a possibility that it could all come crashing down. And that there have been reports in the media about the difficulties the NRA has started running into since these scandals have been unearthed. The financial backing of the NRA is hugely significant. So, for example, in 2016, they spent $30 million helping Trump defeat Clinton. In 2000, they spent $20 million helping Bush defeat Gore, and had a particular gripe with Gore, which we'll go into in a bit more detail shortly. In 2014, they topped the Fortune magazine's top 10 most influential pressure groups in America. In 2012, they ran a series of TV ads attacking Obama over his opposition to the use of armed guards in schools. Now, they do support the political campaigns of many candidates, and when they get elected, they can go on to really important and powerful positions. So two examples of this, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz are now on the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, which has some jurisdiction over gun control and gun laws. And they were both backed by the NRA in their election campaigns, and therefore we can see this connection between the NRA and key figures not only in Congress but actually in the vital committees which affect the area in which it campaigns. They also provided amicus briefings for DC versus Heller, the most significant of recent Supreme Court rulings on gun rights, which ruled the idea that self-protection was a reason for gun ownership, not just joining militia, and again that it was interpreting the Constitution in that way. Now, following the mass shootings, and there have unfortunately been very many of these, there are often demands for much greater gun control, and the NRA has led the way in ensuring these calls are not fully met. So, for example, in 1999 we have the Columbine High School shooting. And there was legislation proposed by Clinton requiring background checks for all firearms purchased at gun shows, which was a loophole where gun shows were being left out of earlier legislation. The vice president at the time was Al Gore, and he cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. But the NRA then managed to defeat the bill in the House, or their lobbying helped lead to the defeat of the bill in the House. Again, and we'll see that this very much put the NRA on at a high alert as Gore then ran for the presidency a year later, and they poured a load of money into making sure Bush won, which he did by the very narrowest of margins. In 2012, we see the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, which led to the Manchin bill. No, Manchin was a Democrat. He was generally not seen as an enemy of the NRA, and he was desperately tried to persuade them and others these greater gun controls were needed following the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and it was unsuccessful. The NRA opposed it, and the bill fell 6 votes short. And all this despite, at the time, overwhelming public support for greater gun control. In 2018, we saw the Parkland school shooting, and survivors and hundreds of thousands of others marched on Washington to demand greater gun control. Trump actually met with the marchers, and there was some suggestion of reviving some of the gun controls that had been proposed by Obama and failed earlier on. Now, following this, the Democrats have taken control of the House in 2018 and the Senate and the presidency in 2020. So there is a suggestion that this time might be different, and definitely that there is a change in attitude amongst younger generations in the US, which might bring about or force change. I hope all that's been helpful for you. If it has, then please hit the like button. If you've any questions or comments, then please leave those below. If you haven't subscribed already and you are interested in UK and US politics, then please do. In particular, if you are an A-level politics student, as I have a playlist which is covering the entire specification as I teach it. And there is also a whole range of other playlists on here for various elements of UK, US and European history. So hopefully there'll be some useful stuff in there for you. Thank you very much for watching.